The first thing Scarlett Monroe did when she walked into Osteria Notte that Friday evening was check the exits. Old habit, journalism habit, survival habit. Now. There were 3. The front entrance, brass-handled, flanked by 2 men in black who didn't carry menus. The kitchen corridor, half visible through a swinging door, smelling of truffle oil and seared meat, and a service exit at the far left, behind the hostess stand, its push bar worn to a dull shine from years of use. She noted all 3 in the time it took to tie her apron strings. Good girl, she told herself. Danny would have checked too. Danny. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm hard, a trick she'd developed to keep her eyes dry in public, and smiled at the hostess. The restaurant was the kind of place where a single entree cost more than Scarlett's monthly electricity bill. Mock black walls, low amber light pooling from fixtures that looked like captured fire, tables spaced so far apart that conversations could be kept truly private. The clientele dressed in quiet money, no logos, no flash, just fabric that draped perfectly and watches that didn't need to announce themselves. Osteria Notte. Night restaurant. Dante Salvatore dined here every Friday at 9 p.m. He took the same table, the round corner booth with the unobstructed sightline to all 3 exits. He stayed exactly 90 minutes. He tipped $400 regardless of the bill. Scarlett had done her research. She'd been doing it for 6 months. 6 months since a black SUV had rolled slowly down a Tuesday afternoon street and put 3 bullets into her 24-year-old brother as he walked out of a bodega with a bottle of water and a bag of chips. 3 bullets. Clean, professional, deliberate. The police had called it gang-related. They'd closed the file in 2 weeks. Scarlett hadn't closed anything. She'd pulled every thread, burned through every source, traced the shooting to Salvatore territory, to Salvatore guns, to a Salvatore order. The evidence wasn't courtroom clean. It was the kind of intelligence that lived in the gray spaces between legal and devastating. She'd brought it to her editor at the Chicago Tribune. He'd told her she was too close, too compromised to write the story. She'd quit the next morning. Now she wore a white uniform apron and carried a tray of wine glasses, and she was going to get close enough to Dante Salvatore to finish what she'd started. The wine had been planned. She'd rehearsed the approach, the slight overcorrection as she leaned to serve the table to his left, the controlled tip of the carafe, the theatrical gasp. She'd chosen a Barolo, specifically. Red, expensive, impossible to hide. She heard his table before she saw it. Not noise, silence. The kind of silence that moves through a room like weather. Conversation dimming, posture adjusting, gazes sliding away with the careful disinterest of people who very much did not want to be caught looking. And then she saw him. Dante Salvatore sat at the corner booth with 3 men she didn't recognize. Suits, hard faces, the particular stillness of men trained never to telegraph movement. But he was unmistakable. Not because she'd studied his photograph for 6 months. Because of the way he occupied the space around him, as if the air itself had decided to defer. He was leaning back against the leather booth, one wrist resting on the table, fingers loosely wrapped around a glass of red wine, not talking, listening to the man across from him with the absolute crystalline focus of someone who misses nothing. His jaw was sharp enough to cut. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly fitted, the top button of his shirt undone. And then, before Scarlett had taken 3 steps toward his table, before she had reached the positioning she'd rehearsed, he looked up. Directly at her. Not around her. Not past her. At her. Those gray eyes settled on her face with the unhurried certainty of a man who'd been waiting. As if he'd heard her coming from the parking lot, as if he'd had her name written in his mind long before she walked through his door. Scarlett's step didn't falter. She was better than that. She veered left, perfect execution, shouldered slightly past a busboy, and let the carafe tilt. The Barolo poured in a dark red cascade directly onto the left shoulder and lapel of Dante Salvatore's suit jacket. The table went utterly still. Scarlett gasped. "Oh God, I'm so sorry, I'm so..." She reached instinctively for the cloth napkin tucked in her apron, pressing it to his shoulder, dabbing at the spreading stain. I'm so sorry, sir. Please let me stop. One word. Quiet as a knife drawn slowly from a sheath. Her hand froze. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Not even the soft orchestral music seemed willing to continue. Scarlett looked up from the stain, tilting her face to meet his, and found him looking at her with an expression she could not read. Not anger, not coldness, not the dangerous flash of a man insulted in public. Curiosity, precise, patient, and somehow far more frightening than rage. "What's your name?" he said. "I? Scarlett. Scarlett Monroe. Sir, I'm truly sorry. The restaurant will of course cover the cleaning cost or replacement if…" Monroe. He said her surname the way a man tests the doorknob he already knows is unlocked. Slow. Already sure. How long have you worked here? She'd been hired 3 weeks ago. She'd spent the first 2 weeks on day shifts, building credibility, before requesting the Friday night rotation. 3 weeks, she said. I'm so sorry about your… Sit down. The words were not a request. Pardon? Sit. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. One of his men had already silently vacated it. I don't like looking up when I speak. Sit down, Miss Monroe. Scarlett's pulse spiked. This was not the plan. The plan was the spill, the apology, the dismissal, the scene. Enough to mark herself in his memory for the follow-up encounter she'd planned for next week. The plan was not sitting at his table. She sat. He studied her with those still, silver-gray eyes. One of the other men at the table murmured something about the meeting, and Dante silenced him with a single raised finger without breaking Scarlett's gaze. You're not from service, he said. It was not a question. Her heart went cold. I'm sorry? Your hands. He glanced at them, just briefly. You hold that tray like someone who learned it recently, and you walked in with the posture of someone who doesn't belong in the room she's standing in. A pause. But you walked toward me anyway. Most people walk away from me. Smart man. She'd known it. She'd planned for it. But knowing and experiencing were two entirely different things. And Dante Salvatore in person was like standing near a fire she hadn't understood. Was that hot? I needed the job, she said simply. The truth, folded around a lie. Something moved in his eyes. Appreciation, maybe. Or recognition. Marco. He spoke to the dark-eyed man at his right. Dawn, Marco leaned in. Run her. Scarlett kept her face absolutely neutral. Marco was already on his phone. Dante lifted his ruined wine glass, took a slow sip, unhurried, unaffected by the dark stain spreading on his $1,000 jacket, and looked at Scarlett as though she were the most interesting thing to happen to him in a very long time. You can stay, he said, while we wait. Stay. As if she had a choice. 15 minutes later, Marco set his phone on the table and leaned close to Dante's ear. Scarlett watched Dante's expression as he listened. It didn't change, not a flicker. He looked at her again. You were a journalist, he said. Until 6 months ago. Another pause perfectly weighted. Around the time your brother died, the floor seemed to shift. She kept her spine straight, kept her chin level. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, and it sounded devastatingly like he meant it. Don't, she said, quietly, precisely. The word came out before she could stop it, and it landed between them like a stone. His eyes sharpened. There she is, they seemed to say. There's the real one. He leaned forward, just slightly, and his voice dropped below the ambient noise of the restaurant, meant only for her. I'm going to have my driver take you somewhere safe tonight, Miss Monroe, and tomorrow we're going to have a very different conversation. His gaze held hers. Calm, absolute, inescapable. Don't try to run. I'll only bring you back. He reached into his jacket, the ruined one, and withdrew a business card. Placed it on the table in front of her. His name. A phone number. Nothing else. You're not going anywhere, he said softly. Not until I understand why you walked into my restaurant with a plan to ruin my suit. The candle between them threw warm light across his face, and Scarlett Monroe, who had planned every single detail of this evening, understood for the first time that she was not the hunter in this room. She never had been. Scarlett's apartment was a third-floor walk-up in Lincoln Square. 2 rooms. Good light. Bookshelves along every wall, a whiteboard in the second bedroom buried under photographs and printed documents and red string connecting names and dates and locations. Danny's wall. She'd built it over 6 months. Everything she knew, everything she'd traced, every thread she'd pulled until her fingers bled. She had exactly 40 minutes to hide it before they arrived. She knew they were coming. Dante had told her as much. Somewhere safe tonight, with the measured certainty of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to make someone comply. She'd walked out of the restaurant at 10:30 and driven home in controlled silence, hands steady on the wheel, brain running at full speed. Option 1, run. She dismissed it in under 3 seconds. He'd said it himself. He'd find her. Option 2, destroy the evidence board before they came. She was already moving. She pulled the photographs down first. The surveillance shots she'd taken herself, the printed DMV records, the crime scene report she'd obtained through a source she'd spent 2 years cultivating at the CPD. She folded them into a Ziploc bag, taped it beneath the bathroom vanity behind the drain panel. The red string she balled and stuffed into her coat pocket. The whiteboard she wiped clean with a cloth soaked in rubbing alcohol, then filled with grocery lists and appointment reminders, smearing the surface enough to look like casual domestic chaos. She was on her couch, laptop open to a Netflix queue she'd never watch, tea steaming by the time the knock came. Not urgent, not demanding. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Patient. She opened the door to Marco Valentino. He was leaning against the doorframe with the ease of someone who did this daily, hands in his pockets, dark eyes sweeping her apartment in exactly the way she'd swept the restaurant. Professional, thorough, quick. Ready? He said. I haven't agreed to go anywhere. The Don said you'd say that. He smiled, and it was almost charming. He also said to tell you that the alternative is staying here while we post 2 men outside your door for the foreseeable future. Your choice. Their presence is more conspicuous than ours. Their presence. She looked past him. 2 large men stood at the top of the stairwell, facing away, postures relaxed, but bodies positioned to block both directions of egress. She grabbed her bag. The Salvatore estate sat on 11 acres in Barrington, 35 minutes northwest of the city. As the SUV turned through wrought iron gates and the floodlights carved the grounds from the darkness, Scarlett processed what she was seeing. A limestone manor house, 4 stories, Georgian columned, surrounded by the kind of mature trees that had been growing since before anyone alive could remember. Security cameras at 12-second rotation intervals. Men stationed at the gate and at the steps, and undoubtedly at intervals around the perimeter. A fortress dressed as a home, she was given a room on the 3rd floor. Guest suite, large windows with an interior courtyard view, ensuite bathroom with a soaking tub and products that cost more than her rent. White linens, fresh flowers. A tray of food she hadn't asked for and a note from someone named Elena, household staff, saying the kitchen was available at all hours. A cage lined in silk. She slept, barely, and woke to gray morning light and the sound of activity below. Dante found her in the breakfast room at 7:40. He came in alone, suit jacket absent, sleeves rolled to the elbow, coffee in hand, and he looked, infuriatingly, like a man who'd slept perfectly. He set his coffee on the table, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat with the comfort of someone entirely at home in his own kingdom, which he was. You didn't run, he said. Your men are very thorough. She met his eyes across the table. And I told you, I needed the job. You don't need a waitressing job, Miss Monroe. You have a journalism degree from Northwestern, 3 years of crime reporting, a freelance reputation that opened doors at 4 major publications, and a bank account that tells me you haven't touched your savings since you quit the Tribune. He picked up his coffee. Which means you're living on something else. What are you living on? She said nothing. He set the cup down. I'm not your enemy. That's exactly what my enemy would say. Something crossed his face. Not offense, not amusement. Something quieter. Something that looked, briefly, like recognition. Your rules while you're here, he said, shifting smoothly. You don't leave the grounds without Marco or me. You don't use your phone to contact certain numbers. We'll provide a list. You eat when you're hungry, sleep when you're tired, and you don't go into the East Wing. And if I refuse your rules? Then I worry about your safety more than I currently do, and I have more men posted closer to you. A pause. My hospitality is genuine, Miss Monroe. The restrictions are protective. Protective, she repeated. From what? From the people who killed your brother. He said it without inflection, clean and direct, like a diagnosis. They know you're digging. They've known for months. You walking into my restaurant didn't go unnoticed by anyone who was watching. The certainty in his voice unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. I own you now, he said. And then, at the slight flinch of her expression, he added softly, the responsibility of you. I claimed it the moment I let you sit at my table. In my world, that means something. In his world. Scarlett looked at this man across the breakfast table, the man she'd spent 6 months building a case against, the man she'd planned to destroy, and felt the first hairline fracture in the story she'd told herself about him. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm and held the line. For now. By day 3, Scarlett had mapped the estate, not because she was planning to escape. She'd amended that objective after her second conversation with Marco, who had a habit of saying more than Dante intended in the sardonic, sideways fashion of a man who trusted his own judgment more than he trusted orders. But because she was a journalist in the bone-marrow deep way, and an idle Scarlett Monroe was an observing one, the East Wing was Dante's office and private quarters. She stayed out of it. The ground floor ran as a compound, a formal dining room used for what Marco called family business, code she understood perfectly, a study with a bar, a security room she was not supposed to know about and had located on day 1, and a kitchen that smelled permanently of espresso and fresh bread because Elena, 70 years old and apparently immovable, baked every morning without exception. The staff knew her name by day 2, Elena Feder. The security men nodded. The men in suits who moved through the house like weather patterns adjusted their routes without comment. She had become a fixture. That was, she understood, exactly what she needed to be. She found Dante at 6 a.m., on the 3rd morning in the courtyard behind the main house, sparring with a man twice her weight. No shirt. She hadn't expected that. She should have kept walking. She didn't. He moved with the economy of someone trained from childhood. No wasted motion. No unnecessary aggression, every action purposeful and efficient. The man he sparred with was thick-necked and serious and was still losing ground steadily, backing toward the stone wall with the incremental certainty of someone who knew how this ended. 3 minutes in, Dante put him down with a lock that transitioned from standing to the ground in under 2 seconds. Stood, shook out his hands, looked directly at Scarlett, who had stopped on the garden path with her coffee mug raised halfway. Enjoying the show? He said. You shouldn't always take the ground position, she said. It came out before she could stop it. If there are 2 opponents, you've limited your mobility. Silence. The man on the ground looked at her. Marco, appearing from somewhere with coffee of his own, raised both eyebrows. Dante studied her. Who trained you? My brother. Her voice stayed even. Danny, who had 2 years of Krav Maga and insisted she learn with him because their neighborhood wasn't safe and their father was gone and he was 17 and taking the job of protection very seriously. He was thorough. Something shifted in Dante's expression. She couldn't name it. Walk with me, he said. They walked the grounds for 40 minutes. He told her in the careful, measured way of a man choosing exactly what to reveal and exactly what to withhold. The shape of the world she'd landed in, the Salvatore family controlled the northwest corridor of Chicago's criminal infrastructure. Not just in the brutal sense, but in the architectural sense. Protection contracts, labor arrangements, import channels, political relationships that stretched into city hall and county courts and federal offices. You're not romanticizing it, she said at one point. I don't require romance, he said. It's what it is. And the violence? He looked at her sideways, and the morning light caught his jaw, his throat, the line of his shoulder. Every government on Earth controls its population through the monopoly of force, he said. We're simply more honest about it in this business. She wanted to argue. She also thought uncomfortably that he wasn't entirely wrong. Someone's been moving against my operations for 8 months, he said then, matter-of-factly, as if continuing a conversation she'd already been part of. Systematically, knowing routes, schedules, names, an inside source. He paused. Do you know what I do to people who betray this family, Miss Monroe? She held his gaze. I imagine it isn't pleasant. It isn't. He said it without relish, a fact, not a threat. Whoever it is has cost me 2 men, 3 operations, and… A fractional pause, so small she almost missed it, and someone I trusted. Danny. The word detonated silently in her chest. She kept her face still. That evening, Marco found her in the library. She'd been given access to it freely because Marco had said, with that sardonic eyebrow, that the Don believed literacy should be encouraged. She was reading about the Rossi family history, a biographical account published in 2019, the kind of vanity project that told you more in what it omitted than what it said. You're good, Marco said, dropping into the chair across from her. Better than good, actually. Most people, when they're scared, fidget. Avoid eye contact. You do the opposite. You hold still and you watch. Is that a compliment or a warning? Both. He poured 2 glasses of scotch from the decanter on the side table, pushed one toward her. He knows you're hiding something, you know. He always knows. Then why keep me here? Marco looked at his glass. Because whatever you're hiding, he believes it connects to Danny Monroe's death. In that case… He paused. That case is the one thing Dante Salvatore hasn't been able to close. The fire in the hearth cracked. Somewhere outside the windows, in the dark beyond the garden, a shadow moved along the tree line. Unhurried, deliberate, stopping precisely where the cameras had their longest rotation gap. Someone was watching the estate. Marco saw it the same moment she did. He was on his feet and on his radio in the same motion, voice dropping to the clipped efficiency of a man for whom this was simply another Tuesday. He looked at Scarlett. Stay here. She stayed for exactly 90 seconds after he left. Then she moved to the window, studied the tree line, noted the direction of movement, and pulled out the burner phone she'd sewn into the lining of her jacket. She sent one text to Ava Chen. They're watching the house. Rossi? Ava's reply came in 40 seconds. Rossi's men followed you from the restaurant. They think you're working on Dante now. Scarlett, they're going to come for you. She deleted the thread, pocketed the burner, and returned to her chair. Someone's watching. Someone's coming. And for the first time since she'd poured red wine on Dante Salvatore's suit, she wasn't entirely certain who the real enemy was. The first time he touched her, it wasn't planned by either of them. It was day 7 of her residence in the Salvatore estate, and someone had tried to put a bullet through the library window. Not Scarlett specifically. She understood that later, after her heart rate had returned to something approaching human. But someone was making a statement. The shot came through the glass at 11 p.m. While she was reading, and it struck the mahogany bookshelf 12 inches from her left shoulder, punching through Crime and Punishment, with a dull, decisive thud before burying itself in the plaster behind it. She was on the floor before the glass finished falling, behind the solid base of the reading desk, because Danny had also been thorough about what to do when someone shot at you. The next 30 seconds were controlled chaos. Running feet shouted commands, the distant percussion of more shots outside, then silence of the specific kind that meant the threat had been neutralized or had retreated. Dante came through the library door at the 40-second mark. He found her behind the desk, crouched, breathing measured, eyes up. She watched him scan the room. Glass, the book, the plaster dust still settling, and then find her. The look on his face when he did was something she hadn't been prepared for. Not relief, exactly. Something more primal than relief. Something closer to the expression of a man who has just discovered that a part of himself he thought safely dormant is, in fact, very much alive. He crossed the room in 4 strides and crouched in front of her. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." He reached out and brushed a fragment of glass from her hair, his fingers grazing her temple, her cheekbone. With a gentleness so absolute it stopped her breath. His hand stilled against the side of her face, and she felt the warmth of his palm like something her body had been starving for without her permission. She should have pulled back. "Dante, don't." He said it quietly. "Don't tell me you're fine in that voice you use, just—" He exhaled. "Let me look at you." He looked at her, thoroughly, cataloging every inch of her face in the low light, as if committing her to some internal record he intended to keep forever. She watched something move through his eyes, the motion of a man dismantling walls he built over years, one brick at a time against his will and knowing it. "Who shot at my house?" she said, because one of them had to be practical. "A warning," he said grimly, standing, drawing her up with him, his hand at her elbow, then her back, warm and certain. "Rossi is telling me he knows you're here. He's telling me—" He stopped. His jaw tightened to granite. "He's telling you I'm a liability," she finished. "He's telling me that anyone I protect becomes a target." Dante turned away, moved to the window frame, the open-air hole of it, and looked out at the night. His voice, when it came, was controlled but stripped of its usual careful armor. "I was 12 years old when my father's enemies came for our family. There was a woman. Not my mother, she'd been gone 3 years by then, a woman my father had placed under his protection. Her name was Katerina. She was the mother of 2 of my closest friends." A pause. "They killed her to send him a message, the same way they're sending me one now." Scarlett did not move, did not speak. "I didn't protect her," he said. "I was 12 and I didn't know what I know now. But I have spent 22 years knowing I should have done more." He turned from the window. "I will not make that mistake again." "Is that what I am?" she asked. "A mistake you're preventing?" He looked at her across the glass-strewn floor, the broken spine of Dostoevsky between them. "No," he said. "You're the reason I just remembered what protecting something actually feels like." She crossed the room. She didn't decide to do it. Her body decided. Months of grief and rage and the grinding loneliness of carrying a mission alone. It all cracked along a single fault line when he said those words, and she walked to him and stood close enough that she had to tilt her face up to meet his eyes. He cupped her face in both hands, deliberate, unhurried, as if he'd been rehearsing this moment without knowing it. "You're going to tell me to stop," he said. "Probably," she agreed. He kissed her, slow, deep, the kind of kiss that doesn't ask permission so much as stake a claim. Not violently, but absolutely. His hands moved from her face to her waist, pulling her in until there was no space left between them, and she felt the solid heat of him, the contained force of him, the careful gentleness of him, which was somehow the most undoing thing of all. She kissed him back. God help her. She kissed him back. When they finally broke apart, they stood breathing the same air, his forehead against hers. "I'll burn the world for you," he said quietly, not dramatically, the way a man states a fact he's only just discovered. "I need you to understand that." She understood it. That was the terrifying part. She also needed to understand whether he had burned her brother first. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm in the dark, where he couldn't see. She found the file by accident, or what she told herself was accident. The truth was more complicated. She'd been moving through the estate's rhythms for 2 weeks now, learning its tides, and she knew Dante spent Thursday mornings in the city at the Salvatore Holdings offices and left the estate lighter by half its usual complement of men. She also knew that Marco took his coffee on the East Terrace at 9 and was reachable only by radio between 9 and 10. She had a 40-minute window. She used it. The locked drawer in Dante's study yielded to a pic she'd been carrying in her bra since night 1. Another Danny-era lesson, delivered with his particular combination of seriousness and barely suppressed laughter. Always carry a pic scar. The world is full of locked things. She'd cried the first time she remembered that 6 months ago, alone in her empty apartment. Now she used it clean and efficient, the way he'd taught her. The file was in the second drawer. DM. Danny Monroe, her breath caught in a manila folder 3 inches thick. She sat on the floor and read it. It took her 22 minutes and dismantled 6 months of her certainty. Danny Monroe had been an informant. Not police, not FBI, Salvatore. He'd approached Dante's organization 14 months ago through a mutual contact with intelligence on Sebastian Rossi's planned expansion into Salvatore territory. He'd been reporting for 8 months before he died. The file contained meeting records, payment histories, and, in the final pages, Dante's handwritten notes after Danny's death, clipped to a photograph she recognized. It was Danny at 20, eyes like hers, laughing at something off-camera. Dante's handwritten note read, "DM was compromised." Rossi knew. Source, still unidentified. Find it. Find who ordered the hit. He trusted us. We owe him justice. Scarlett sat on the floor of Dante Salvatore's study and felt the entire architecture of her mission collapse around her. She was still sitting there when Marco found her. He stood in the doorway, looked at her, looked at the file in her hands, said nothing for a long moment. "How long?" she asked. "Has he known who you were?" Marco came in, closed the door, sat in the chair facing her. "Since you applied to work at the restaurant, one of our people flagged the application. Monroe, journalism background, brother recently deceased. Dante ran you himself. He knew I thought he killed Danny." "Yes, and he let me in anyway." "He invited you in," Marco said quietly, "because you're Danny's sister, and because he blamed himself for not protecting Danny, and because..." He stopped. "Because what?" Marco looked at her with eyes that had seen too much to pretend. "Because the moment you poured that wine on his suit, he saw someone who loved Danny Monroe enough to walk into a lion's den for him. And Dante Salvatore doesn't know how to not protect the people his instincts recognize as worth protecting." She closed the file. "Who killed my brother?" "We believe Lorenzo Greco, acting on Rossi's orders." Marco's voice was flat with controlled anger. "Lorenzo was Dante's cousin, his underboss. He's been Rossi's man for 2 years. We didn't know until..." He exhaled. "Until recently. Lorenzo." A face she'd seen in photographs. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, always half a step behind Dante at public events, wearing the comfortable ease of a man certain of his place. The traitor in the house. "Does Dante know?" she said. "He suspects. He doesn't yet have proof he can act on without tearing the family apart." Marco met her eyes. "That's what Rossi wants, him to act rashly. Divide the family. Create the opening." That afternoon, 2 of Rossi's men found Scarlett on the grounds. They'd come over the east wall, which meant they'd had inside knowledge of the camera rotation. One grabbed her arm before the second Salvatore sentry got to them. The fight lasted 40 seconds. Scarlett broke 2 of the first man's fingers with a technique Danny had drilled her on for months and used the opening to headbutt the second hard enough to drop him. The Salvatore guard arrived to find her standing over 2 incapacitated men, breathing hard and apparently angrier than she was frightened. That evening, Dante stood in his study doorway and looked at her across the room. She was sitting in the chair, the correct chair this time, with a glass of wine and the particular stillness of someone who has processed something massive and arrived at a new country. "You read the file," he said. "Yes." He didn't look angry. "I should have told you sooner." "Yes," she said again. He sat across from her, mirroring her posture. And for a long moment they just existed in the same room with all of it. Her grief, his guilt, the complicated, tangled truth of what Danny had been and what they both were now. "I'm going to find who did it," he said. "I give you my word." "I know who did it," she said. She told him what Marco had confirmed, watching his face as she did, the controlled quietude of it fracturing along specific fault lines when she said Lorenzo's name, his jaw tightening to the point of pain. Betrayal suspected. She watched him fold it into himself, process it, convert it into something cold and absolutely purposeful. "Then we find the proof together," he said. She looked at this man across the low firelight. This dangerous, careful, unexpectedly tender man who had been carrying her brother's photograph in his desk drawer. "And made a choice. Together," she said. The assassination attempt came on a Tuesday, in broad daylight, in the parking structure beneath Salvatore Holdings' Michigan Avenue office. Scarlett was not supposed to be there. She had come because Ava had forwarded her an intelligence thread, anonymous, sourced through one of Scarlett's former CPD contacts, that referenced a planned action against the Dawn on Tuesday, location unspecified. She'd called Marco. Marco hadn't answered. She'd called the estate. She'd been put on hold by a man who didn't understand that hold was not an appropriate response to imminent assassination, so she'd driven downtown. She found the parking structure at level 3, and she found the shooter positioned behind a support column, weapon leveled, waiting for the elevator doors to open. She did not think. She moved. She hit the man from the side. A full shoulder charge, the way a corner midfielder hits a striker going for goal. At the precise moment the elevator opened and Dante stepped out with 2 of his men, the shot went wide. The gun skittered. The shooter recovered faster than she anticipated, pivoting, forearm coming down toward her throat. And then, he was simply gone. Dante had him, one hand, collar, and put him into the concrete support column with a single controlled impact that ended the conversation permanently. Silence. Dante turned to find Scarlett on the ground where the momentum had taken her, one knee on concrete, breathing steadily, looking up at him with green eyes that were sharp and alive and not frightened at all. The expression that moved across his face was not describable by simple vocabulary. It was fury and terror and relief and something so raw that his 2 men looked deliberately away. He crossed to her in 3 steps and pulled her up, both hands, hauling her to standing, and then held her there, his grip on her arms unwavering, as if releasing her was not a physical option he was currently capable of. "Tell me you're not hurt," he said. "I'm not hurt. Tell me you didn't just charge an armed man because your phone calls went to hold. I would prefer not to confirm that." Scarlett. Her name, from his mouth, in that voice, low and fractured at the edges, undid something structural in her chest. If that shot had been 2 degrees left, it wasn't. If it had. His hands tightened on her arms. The controlled exterior, the one he wore like armor, the one she'd spent 3 weeks studying, cracked entirely open. Underneath it was something vast and terrified and absolutely, irrevocably certain. "You are mine," he said. Not possessively. Not dominantly. The way a man names a truth he can no longer contain. Mine to protect, mine to. He stopped. Started again, quieter. "I cannot do what I need to do in this world if you are not in it. Do you understand that? That's a very inconvenient thing to discover," she said softly. "I know." He pulled her in, both arms, fully, chest to chest, and held her with the particular fierceness of someone embracing a thing they are terrified of losing. She felt his heartbeat under her ear, fast and human, and pressed her palm flat against his chest above it like she could slow it down. "I love you," she said into his shirt, because it was true and because standing in a parking structure over an unconscious would-be assassin was apparently the exact circumstances under which Scarlett Monroe discovered she had fallen, entirely in love with the wrong man, or possibly the only right one. He was still for 1 breath. 2. "Say that again," he said. "Not a chance." He pulled back just far enough to see her face, and then he kissed her, not gently, not carefully, but with the full weight of everything he'd been holding back since a Friday evening and a ruined suit and a woman who walked toward him when everyone else walked away. When they came up for air, Marco was leaning against the elevator with the expression of a man who has long since made peace with his life choices. "The car is here," Marco said. "Also, war is coming," he added in roughly the same tone. "Rossi knows the hit failed. He's going to escalate." Dante looked at Scarlett. The tenderness in his face hardened into something forged and absolute. "Then we escalate first," he said. "The war came the way all wars do, not all at once, but in stages, each one worse than the last. The first strike, a Salvatore supply warehouse on the south side, torched in the early hours of Wednesday morning. 2 workers barely escaped. The structure was a total loss. Dante stood in the smoking ruin at 4 a.m., dressed in black, and his face was the face of a man doing mathematics in his head. Not emotional equations, but tactical ones. The cold geometry of retribution. The second, a Salvatore associate, a city councilman who had been under family protection for 11 years, was found in his car outside his home. He was alive. The envelope on his passenger seat contained photographs of his children. The message was unmistakable. "We know where everything you love lives." The third came for Scarlett. She was with Ava. She'd finally been permitted a supervised meeting. Marco sitting 3 tables away at the coffee shop, pretending to read. When 2 men in a dark sedan pulled up outside, Marco saw them first. He was up and moving before either woman fully processed the threat. Phone to his ear, voice quiet and rapid. "We need to leave," he told Scarlett. "Ava, she comes with us." They got out through the kitchen. The manager was apparently on the Salvatore payroll, a development Scarlett would examine her feelings about later, and into a waiting vehicle. The 2 men from the sedan followed. They were dissuaded, efficiently, by the 3 vehicles that materialized from intersecting streets with the smooth precision of a maneuver rehearsed many times. At the estate that evening, Dante called a full family meeting. 12 men around the dining table. Suits, hard faces, the collective weight of generations of brutal loyalty. Scarlett stood at the edge of the room and watched him address them. Standing. Not sitting. His presence at the head of the table, the kind of natural authority that has nothing to do with furniture arrangement. He laid out the Rossi situation with surgical clarity. The warehouse, the councilman, the ongoing intelligence leak, the identity of the inside source he now had evidence to support. Lorenzo Greco sat 6 chairs from Dante's right hand. Scarlett watched Lorenzo's face throughout. It was very good, very controlled, but she'd spent years reading faces professionally, and his told her everything she needed. The micro-tension around the eyes when Dante mentioned the intelligence leak, the fractional pause before he nodded at each point, the way his hands stayed too still in his lap. He knows Dante is closing in. After the meeting, Marco didn't come back. He'd been sent on a retrieval operation. Documents from a Rossi-adjacent accountant who'd reached out seeking protection in exchange for financial records. A routine acquisition in ordinary times. These were not ordinary times. At midnight, a Salvatore man found Marco's vehicle abandoned on the I-90 ramp. Engine still running, door open. Dante's face when he received the call. Scarlett watched it from across the room, watched the way it went. Very still in the way of a man choosing between grief and choosing action because grief has no use until the work is done. "Marco," she said quietly. "Rossi has him." Dante's voice was stripped to bone. "He's sending me a message." He looked at her. "Stay here. Don't leave this building. Don't trust anyone except Elena." He came to her, caught her face in his hands for one brief searing moment. "I will be back. Dante, promise me you'll stay." She saw the fracture behind his eyes, the Caterina fracture, the 12-year-old boy who'd lost someone because he hadn't moved fast enough. "I promise," she said. He left with 8 men. From the window, Scarlett watched the convoy pull out into the dark. Beside her, Elena set a hand on her shoulder without speaking. Scarlett stayed, for exactly 4 hours. Then Lorenzo Greco walked into her room with 2 men she hadn't seen before and a syringe, and she learned that the promise she'd made to Dante was the one he'd needed most from her, and she was about to be unable to keep. She woke in a room that smelled of salt and industrial cleaner and old metal. Warehouse. Port district, she determined from the distant sound of foghorns and the creak of structural steel. She was zip-tied to a chair, wrists behind her back. Tight but not cutting, the kind of restraint applied by someone who knew the difference between immobilization and injury. Her mouth tasted of copper. Her temple ached where she'd hit the floor when the sedative took her. Inventory. Danny's voice in her head, clinical and calm. "Take inventory before you move. Hands, secured but circulation intact. Feet, zip-tied to chair legs less tight. Head pain, minor. Weapons, none visible. But she was still wearing the jacket and the pick in the lining. Gone. They'd found it. The burner phone was also gone. The room had 3 walls of bare concrete, one of corrugated metal sheeting warehouse, definitely. And a single work light overhead. Beside the light, a camera. Small, wireless, its indicator blinking red. Live feed. He's watching. The door opened. Sebastian Rossi walked in as if entering a boardroom, black suit, silver hair, perfectly arranged, a bearing that radiated the particular confidence of a man who had never once, in 50 years of carefully arranged life, been surprised by his own reflection, Miss Monroe. He sat across from her in the room's only other chair, crossed his leg, and looked at her with the assessor's gaze of someone appraising an asset. I've been watching your progress with considerable admiration. You almost did what I planned for you to do. Almost, she said. Her voice was steady. She'd decided it would be. The plan was elegant, I thought. Danny Monroe's grieving sister, burning with righteous rage, positioned perfectly inside the Salvatore operation. She gathers intelligence, she destroys trust. She burns the empire from within. He spread his hands. And in the wreckage, the Rossi family absorbs the Salvatore territory without firing a single shot in a real war. Except I didn't destroy him. No. A slight tightening around his eyes. You fell in love with him, which is both romantically predictable and professionally catastrophic. He leaned forward. But it's a solvable problem. If Dante Salvatore believes you've been taken because you helped me, he won't believe that. He will when he sees the text messages I've had prepared from your number. He gestured to the phone on the table beside him. Her phone. She recognized the case. Technology is a remarkable tool. Scarlett looked at the camera. She looked at Rossi. You killed my brother, she said. Danny Monroe was an inconvenient liability. No hesitation, not even a performance of remorse. He was feeding information to Salvatore that would have compromised 5 years of infrastructure development. Eliminating him and framing Dante for it was efficient. Say that again, she said. I beg your pardon. I asked you to say it again. She held his gaze. For the camera. Rossi's eyes flicked to the camera, returned to her, went very still. That camera, she said, has been live feeding to Ivajichen's laptop for the last 4 minutes. She receives a feed from any device in the room with me through a proximity Bluetooth protocol we established when I went into the restaurant. It's transmitting to her, and she's broadcasting it. A pause. Hello, Ava. The color had drained from Rossi's face. You're bluffing, he said. I've been a journalist for 6 years, Scarlett said. I never go anywhere without a backup protocol. It was, in fact, a bluff. There was no Bluetooth protocol. She'd lost her burner hours ago, but Rossi didn't know that, and uncertainty, even 3 seconds of it, was enough. The door burst open. Dante came through first. He came with 6 men and the specific focused violence of someone who has converted every emotion into kinetic purpose. The Rossi guards in the outer room, 3 of them, had already been neutralized by the time he reached the inner door. He crossed the threshold and found Scarlett zip-tied to a chair, alive, unbroken, looking at him with green eyes that were furious and relieved in roughly equal measure. Rossi went for the gun at his ankle. He was faster than a 50-year-old man in an expensive suit should have been, but Dante was faster still. The gun skittered across the floor. Rossi hit the wall. Dante's forearm pressed to his throat, and the controlled, terrible quiet of his voice filled the room. Where is Marco Valentino? Adjacent building. Room 4. Rossi grounded out. He's alive. Dante looked at Scarlett, one long look, cataloging her, confirming she was intact, and then looked back at Rossi with the absolute certainty of a man who has made an irreversible decision about the future. Lorenzo, he said, and one of his men produced Dante's cousin from the group. Hands zip-tied, face bruised, already processed. Lorenzo didn't meet anyone's eyes. Take them both, Dante said. He crossed to Scarlett, cut her restraints himself with a blade that appeared from nowhere, and when she stood, legs unsteady from the hours in the chair, he caught her. Both arms, the same hold as the parking structure, the same absolute certainty. I told you to stay, he said into her hair. I stayed 4 hours. He held her harder. One of us might die tonight, she heard him say, quiet, not to her but to the room, to the universe, to whatever calculating force kept arranging these encounters. It shouldn't be her. Marco was in the adjacent building, room 4, exactly as Rossi had said. He was alive. He was not undamaged, but he was the kind of man who greeted his own rescue with the dry observation that the accommodations had been substandard, and his coffee had been terrible. Scarlett sat beside him in the vehicle while the medic worked, and Marco looked at her with dark eyes that were clear despite everything. "You found the file," he said. "Before all this started, yes. Good." He settled back. "He needed you to know. He just couldn't figure out how to tell you without it sounding like he was trying to manipulate you." "He was manipulating me. He was protecting you," Marco said. "Those are different things. Dante has never learned to show one without being mistaken for the other." At the estate, the remaining Rossi operation was dismantled in the following 3 hours with the methodical efficiency of a machine Dante had spent decades building precisely for this purpose. Phone calls, meetings, territory negotiations, the Rossi infrastructure collapsing inward as its support structures were systematically removed. Sebastian Rossi and Lorenzo Greco were transported to separate locations that Scarlett did not ask about and did not want to know about. She found Dante in his study at 3 in the morning. He was sitting behind his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, a glass of bourbon untouched in front of him, looking at nothing with the focus of a man replaying a sequence of events and identifying every point where things could have gone differently. She sat across from him. "Lorenzo confessed," he said. "Everything. The Rossi arrangement. The intelligence feeds. Danny." She nodded. "I didn't know," he said. "I need you to believe that, even though I understand you have every reason not to." "I believe it," she said. She'd believed it since the file. She'd been processing it. The grief of it. The disorienting relief of it. The complicated geography of blaming the wrong man. And then finding yourself in love with him. "I should have protected him better," Dante said. He said it quietly, without performance. A man issuing judgment against himself. He trusted this family. He trusted me. And I let the traitor stay too close and too long because he was blood and I was... His jaw tightened. I was wrong. Scarlett stood, moved around the desk, and did what she'd wanted to do since the moment she found Danny's photograph in his drawer. She placed her hand against his jaw, gently, the way you touch something that has been carrying weight too long alone, and lifted his face. "Danny chose to work with you," she said. "He chose to trust you, and he would know the difference between you failing to prevent it and you causing it." Her thumb traced the line of tension in his jaw. "He was my brother. I know how he thought. He didn't give his trust carelessly." Dante closed his eyes. "I'm going to find out everything I can about how he lived in those 8 months," she said. "And I'm going to write it, the real story. Not the one that ends with a drive-by and a closed file. The one that ends with his name meaning something." He caught her hand, both of his around hers, and held it. "Never leaving you again," he said. It wasn't directed at her exactly. It was a vow to the air, to whatever forces had arranged this terrible, necessary collision of their lives. "Whatever that means in the world I live in, whatever it costs, I'm done letting things I value exist outside the circle of what I protect. You should probably warn me before you build a circle. Around something," she said. His eyes opened. And for the first time, the genuine, unguarded first time, Dante Salvatore smiled. Not the controlled approximation she'd seen in public. The performance of warmth for political necessity. A real smile. It changed his entire face. The severity softened. The silver gray of his eyes warming to something that looked almost like a winter day that had decided, against all prior scheduling, to permit a little light. "Fair," he said. "I'll warn you." "Good." She sat on the edge of his desk facing him and looked at him in the low lamplight of 3 in the morning, both of them roughed up and exhausted and alive, Danny's memory between them like something held jointly. "Now, one of us might die tonight. That was what you said in the warehouse." "I said that. It's after 3. I believe tonight is technically over." He stood, bringing their faces level, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Then we made it," he said. "We made it," she agreed. He kissed her forehead, her cheek, the corner of her mouth. each one deliberate, a punctuation of all the moments in the last weeks when touching her had been either too dangerous or too complicated or both. Then, less gently, her mouth, fully, with the whole of everything made survived and the implicit promise of everything still to come. Outside, the estate was quiet for the first time in 2 weeks. The war, it seemed, was nearly over. The final confrontation happened on a Thursday morning in the gray light of Chicago's lake wind. It did not happen in a warehouse or a parking garage or a burning building. It happened in a courtroom, partially, and in a meeting room of the CPD's Organized Crime Division, and in a private conference with an assistant U.S. attorney who had been building a case against Sebastian Rossi for 3 years and had just received, via an anonymous but heavily substantiated digital filing, the financial records, voice recordings, and signed confessions that would bury the Rossi enterprise permanently. Scarlett's backup protocol had not been a bluff. It turned out it had been Ava, recording the Bluetooth device Scarlett hadn't known she still had, the one sewn into the lining of her second jacket layer that Ava had installed 3 weeks prior without telling her because Ava was thorough in the exact way Danny had been, and the ambient room audio had captured Rossi's confession in sufficient quality to be evidentiary. The legal reckoning was satisfying in the way that only legal reckonings can be: cold, slow, and permanent. But there was the other kind. Lorenzo Greco faced the family, what remained of the Salvatore family after the purge of Rossi's embedded operatives, in the formal dining room that had hosted a generation of the family's most consequential decisions. He was not harmed. He was not imprisoned in any Salvatore facility. He was simply, finally, stood before Dante and 12 men who had trusted him and told the truth of what he'd done, in full, with witnesses. Dante stood at the head of the table and said nothing while Lorenzo spoke. When it was finished, the full accounting, the payments, the intelligence feeds, Danny's name, Dante said in a voice of absolute quiet, "You are my family." Lorenzo couldn't meet his eyes. "You were the closest thing I had to a brother," Dante continued, "and you sold that for money, and for fear of a man who is now going to spend the remainder of his life in a federal prison. Was it worth it?" Lorenzo said nothing. "The family is finished with you," Dante said. "Not in the way that once would have been done. Not in blood. You're not worth the weight of that tradition." He looked at him with eyes that had moved beyond anger into something colder and more final: disappointment. The kind that does not repair. Leave Chicago. Leave the state. If you're ever seen in Salvatore territory again, the conversation that follows will be brief. Lorenzo left. 12 men watched him go. Marco, seated at Dante's right hand for the first time since his return, arm in a sling, coffee in his good hand, expression carrying the focused neutrality of a man who has decided precisely what to feel and when, looked at Dante across the table and gave a single, slow nod. "Done. It's done. The Empire's reorganization took 2 weeks. Territory consolidated. Rossi operations absorbed or dissolved. Political relationships realigned with the careful architecture of a man who understood that power is not a destination, but a maintenance project." Dante worked 18-hour days, and Scarlett worked beside him, not in the criminal machinery of it, but in the narrative of it, the reconstruction of the story she was finally free to write. She wrote Danny's story. She published it 6 weeks later under her full name in a piece that ran in a national magazine and won, eventually, a journalism award she would put on a shelf in the Salvatore estate and look at when she needed to remember that grief can become something useful. Dante read it before it published, once alone in his study with the door closed. She didn't ask what he'd felt. She knew. He came to find her afterward in the library and sat beside her on the window seat, close, his shoulder against hers, and said nothing for a long time. "It's finally over," he said at last. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Not over," she said. "Just different now. Better different." She thought of Danny, 24 years old and laughing outside a bodega that was the last place she'd ever imagined him being. And then she thought of the file in Dante's desk and the photograph and the handwritten note that said, "We owe him justice." "Yes," she said. "Better different." Dante's hand found hers in the afternoon light and held it. 2 months after the Rossi trial began, And 5 months after a waitress poured red wine onto a charcoal suit on a Friday evening at Osteria Notte, Dante Salvatore bought back the restaurant. He'd owned it before, through a holding company, a detail Scarlett discovered with the particular combined exasperation and amusement that had become her primary emotional register in relation to this man and his layers. He renovated the private dining room, updated the wine list, retired the specific bottle of Barolo from the menu with the notation, in the sommelier's private log, that it had served its purpose with considerable efficacy. Scarlett did not move back to Lincoln Square. She moved her whiteboard first, then her books. 6 trips, Marco assisting with the philosophy of a man who had made his peace with the situation and was simply managing logistics. Ava helped, occasionally stopping to photograph the absurdity of the situation for reasons she described as documentary purposes. The second bedroom of the estate's East Wing guest suite was repurposed as a writing office. Bookshelves built to specification by a carpenter, Elena sourced from a man who owed the family a favor. 3 months in, Dante called it her office. 4 months in, she found her name on the estate's security clearance master list. She pointed this out to him over dinner. "Efficient," he said. "It's my name on a Mafia compound's security documentation." "Also efficient." "Dante." He set his fork down and looked at her across the table with those winter smoke eyes that still, even now, did something architectural to her chest. "I could take it off," he said, "and put it back on properly instead." She looked at him. "The ring," he said, "is in my jacket pocket. The one I've been carrying for 11 days because every time I decide it's the right moment, something explodes, which admittedly is a reflection of my life choices." He reached into his jacket and set a small black velvet box on the table between the breadbasket and the olive oil. "This is not an ideal proposal. I am aware of that. There's a piece of focaccia on the table. There's also a gun at my ankle, a consigliere, 2 rooms away, and a dining room that's been shot at once and nearly purchased by a rival twice. This is my life, Scarlett. It's always going to have focaccia and firearms in inconvenient proximity." She stared at the box. "I will not make you a peaceful life," he said. "I will make you a protected one. I will build every wall in this city between you and anything that wants to hurt you. I will read every story you write at 3 in the morning and sit beside you while you write the hard ones. I will." He paused, and something almost shy moved through his expression. The ghost of a 12-year-old boy who'd grown up believing the world was either fortress or threat and had just discovered it could occasionally be a dining room with focaccia and the right person. "I will be better at being a person," he said quietly, "because of you. I already am." Scarlett opened the box. The ring was simple, extraordinary in the way of things that don't need to announce themselves. A single large diamond set in platinum, clean-lined and permanent. "Marry me," he said. "Or, and I say this with full awareness that it is both a joke and not, I'll kidnap you again. You can pour wine on me first if it helps." She laughed. She hadn't expected the laugh. It came from somewhere deep and real, the kind of laugh that lives adjacent to tears in the emotional geography, and it broke over her face like light. She picked up the ring, put it on herself because she'd always done things her own way, held her hand out across the table. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. I've been trying to destroy your life for 6 months, and instead, I've ended up in your estate writing about my dead brother and arguing with your consigliere about good scotch. Clearly this was the intended outcome." Dante looked at her ringed hand, at her face, and the smile came again. That rare, real, renovating smile. And he stood and leaned across the focaccia and the firearms and the complexity of everything they were to each other, and kissed her the way he kissed her when no one was watching, slowly, thoroughly, as if he had all the time in the world and intended to use it precisely this way. Marco appeared in the doorway 3 minutes later, clocked the situation, and went silently back the way he'd come. Elena brought out a second bottle of wine, white this time, pointedly, and set it on the table without comment. 8 months later. The wedding was not small. In fairness, Scarlett had not wanted small. She'd spent 6 months embedded in the operational machinery of a crime family and had absorbed, despite herself, The understanding that in this world certain things were done on a scale that matched the significance assigned to them, and Dante Salvatore considered this, her, them, this irrevocable choosing of each other, to be the most significant event of his adult life. He told her so. Twice. Once quietly, on a Tuesday morning over coffee. Once rather more theatrically during a disagreement about the guest list that had ended, as most of their disagreements did, with her being kissed into a somewhat more flexible position. Osteria Note was rented entirely for the evening. 300 guests in the converted space. The walls hung with white roses and candles that threw amber light across every surface. Elena, who had been given an official role she'd described as everything important, sat in the front row in deep burgundy silk and cried from the processional onward. Ava photographed everything. She always photographed everything. Marco stood at Dante's shoulder and did not cry. Because Marco Valentino did not cry at weddings. He did, however, clear his throat at irregular intervals throughout the ceremony, and was careful never to let anyone see his face from the left side. Scarlett wore ivory, not white, because she was who she was, and walked herself down the aisle the way she'd done everything since Danny died, on her own terms, under her own power, with no pretense that she needed someone to give her away. She was not something to be given. She was someone who had arrived. Dante watched her come. He stood at the altar and watched her walk the length of that restaurant, past the table where he'd run her background on a Friday evening, and found a journalist's name attached to a dead man's, and his face was the face of a man seeing the full architecture of something vast and improbable and entirely real. When she reached him, he took her hand, both of his around hers. "You're late," he murmured. "I was collecting myself. How'd that go?" "I'm here, aren't I?" They were married under Italian and civil ceremony, both. The priest managed both with the particular practiced serenity of a man who had made his peace with the nature of the families he served. Dante's vows were not short. He had written them himself, and they were the most honest thing Scarlett had ever heard him say in public. An itemized accounting of what she was to him, what she'd changed, what he had learned from her about the difference between power and love, and why a man could spend a lifetime confusing one for the other. She said when her turn came, "I came into your life planning to ruin you. I succeeded a little. You ruined me right back. I think that's probably what love is. Two people destroying the worst versions of each other until something real gets through. You are the most inconvenient, complicated, genuinely astonishing thing that has ever happened to me, and I am going to write about you for the rest of my life. I hope you know that," he said, very quietly, so only she could hear. "I'm counting on it, Bella." He kissed her when the priest said he could, which the guests understood meant 2 seconds. But Dante had never been entirely obedient to ceremony, and the kiss lasted considerably longer, and the room didn't seem to mind. Later, much later, they stood on the terrace of the estate, newly returned from a Venice honeymoon that had involved no criminal activity whatsoever, which Scarlett considered a personal achievement, while the city of Chicago glittered below the darkness of the suburban hills. She leaned back against his chest. His arms came around her. "Danny would have liked this," she said. A pause. "He did," Dante said, "in the way that the things we carry of people we've loved come with us into the moments they should have seen." She pressed her hand over his, where it rested against her abdomen. A small thing. A new thing. Only 3 weeks confirmed, only known between them. She felt him understand it. The stillness that moved through his body. "Scarlett. Is this?" "Yes." His arms tightened. She felt his face press into her hair, and the breath he released was long and unsteady in the way of a man who has just discovered that the world is, against all evidence and prior experience, capable of giving him something he hadn't known how to want until he was standing here with it. Below, Chicago burned its quiet thousand lights. The Salvatore Empire thrived, restructured, legitimate in more places than it had ever been, Scarlett's influence threading through it like a different kind of architecture. More story, more truth, more of the human grain that centuries of power had worn smooth. She was writing 3 pieces, one on organized crime reform, one on Danny, the sequel, the one about what he'd done in those 8 months. The real story, and one she hadn't told Dante about yet because it wasn't ready, because some things needed to live privately first before they could be made public. It was called The Man I Ruined. It was, among other things, the story of a Friday night, a carafe of wine, a charcoal suit, and the precise moment that a woman set out to destroy a man and discovered that destruction and love, in the right hands, could be the same furious act of transformation. Dante's voice was low at her ear. "What are you thinking?" She smiled in the dark. "That I'm glad I spilled the wine," she said. His laugh, real, warm, entirely his, rose into the Chicago night. "Me too, Miss Monroe," he said. "Me too." The city below them pulsed and breathed and went on living, and Dante Salvatore held his wife, and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, that the thing moving through his chest was not strategy or calculation or the cold machinery of power. It was simply, entirely, a heart, still beating, still his, and now, irrevocably, hers.